Instinct. This story is true about what my husband experienced one summer in the mid-90s while working as a groundskeeper at a camp for kids. It was the early 90s, and at the time my husband, Eddie, just passed his 19th birthday, hadn't yet decided whether or not he wanted to go to college. He had recently lost touch with most of his high school friends and as such, didn't have much planned for the summer. So, when the offer to be a live-in groundskeeper at a children's day camp came his way, Eddie was happy to take the opportunity. He lived in a rural area of Ontario, so the camp, surrounded by trees and having its own small lake, was secluded enough to have peace and quiet, but not so far away that he couldn't manage a trip home on the off days. While the seclusion wasn't geographically extreme, once everyone left on Friday afternoons, all the children were gone, the day staff back home to their families, the place was actually really eerie. This was magnified by the fact that at the time, Eddie didn't have a car, and the only phone was about a 20-minute walk from his tiny cabin at the back of the property along a dark dirt path. This meant that most evenings and weekends were spent next to a campfire or inside the cabin with the door locked, listening to loud music and having a few drinks. Usually, the property was really quiet and it would actually get boring out there with no one to talk to and nothing to do. Eddie once told me that he would pass time by canoeing around the tiny lake, which was more like a large pond, and catching every turtle he could find. He would place them in the bottom of the canoe, with some water and lily pads so they were comfortable. Then once he caught everyone he could find, he would canoe to different parts of the lake and put them back one by one. So, obviously, there wasn't much going on in the area. It was one quiet night, however, where despite how peaceful it seemed, there was definitely something evil happening out in those trees and fields. The night started like any other. It was a warm Saturday in Ontario, which meant that the bugs were biting and you could drown in the humidity. It was getting toward the end of the summer and Eddie had gotten into the weekly routines, cleaning and fixing things around the camp during the weekdays, then wandering around the property on the weekends. This Saturday had started off no different than the others. Eddie had done a quick security sweep of the area in the morning to make sure nothing was amiss, then spent the afternoon paddling around the lake catching turtles. A few hours before sundown, Eddie was back at his cabin and had built a nice campfire. He always made sure to start the fire before dark. On this Saturday, Eddie had spent the evening cooking a meal over the fire and reading his favorite Stephen King novel, The Stand. He had listened to the weather forecast on the little cabin radio earlier that morning and was aware there was a chance of some nasty thunderstorms that night. He was keeping a close eye on the wind and the clouds as night rolled in, knowing that even this far north, the heat and humidity were known to give rise to fearsome tornadoes every few years. Not long after he finished his meal, the sky turned dark and the wind began to pick up. Eddie doused his fire and was starting to pack up his book and his dishes when he heard something moving through the brush. He stopped and listened for a moment. The rustling continued, but figuring it was a raccoon or a deer, Eddie went about his business, more concerned with the approaching storm. Once in the cabin, Eddie locked the door and felt a little more secure. He turned on the single, unshaded light bulb that hung above the sink. The rickety cabin wasn't much. It had no bathroom and no stove, just a mini fridge, sink, a hot plate, and a musty bed. As rickety as it was, it still had a lock on the door and the only window was too small for a person to fit through without a struggle. Soon, Eddie was getting settled back in with his book. It wasn't long before the rustling sound he had heard outside returned, but this time it sounded like something was brushing up against the outside wall of the cabin. Still thinking it was just an animal, Eddie tried to keep his attention on his book. The curtains on the window were closed, so he couldn't see outside, but he knew it was dark and thought he heard the distant rumbling of thunder. The rustling and brushing sound was right outside his door now. He wasn't sure, but he thought he had heard the handle jiggle. Suddenly the rustling turned to a crashing, and it sounded like 2 or 3 people were running away from the cabin. This startled Eddie, causing him to drop his book. Maybe that wasn't just a deer after all. Eddie thought out loud. He stood up and hesitated. What was he going to do? Part of his job was to watch out for trespassers and notify them that they had to leave if he found any. Usually, this was an easy job. He had only run into this a couple of times, and on both occasions, it was a group of local kids taking a nighttime swim in the pond. Usually, he scared them more than they scared him. Thinking this was probably the case, the local kids having found his cabin and decided to play a bit of a prank on him, Eddie grabbed his keys and his flashlight and headed for the door. He could hear the wind howling and the rain starting to tap on the roof. Not quite a downpour yet. He took a deep breath and was about to open the door when he heard a gentle tapping on the window. This was obviously not rain. The hairs on his arms stood at attention. His blood ran cold even in the stuffy and sweltering heat of late July. He was frozen with his hand on the doorknob. Not even breathing. Something in his stomach was telling him to remain completely still, and whatever he did to not open the door. After a few minutes, the tapping hadn't returned. The rain was coming down harder now, and Eddie began to breathe again. He let go of the doorknob and immediately turned off the light. He quietly got under the covers, not even bothering to take off his shoes or put back the large, metal flashlight, in case whatever it was that was out there came back. Eventually, he fell asleep. The next morning, Eddie awoke and felt no sign of the eerie presence from the night before. He got up and immediately noticed that the storm had passed and the morning sun was shining through the curtains. Groggy and a bit shaken, Eddie splashed some water on his face and began to rummage through the fridge for something to eat. He was just debating whether he wanted to cook his eggs and bacon over the fire, or if the firewood was too damp when there was a loud knock at the door. Eddie jumped and almost soiled his pants. No one had even shown up unannounced way out here on a Saturday. "Eddie, it's Jim, your mom's friend from work. Are you in there?" Eddie recognized the voice. His mom worked in dispatch for the local police department. Eddie, being a bit of a troublemaker in a small town, knew the members of the force both from family BBQs and from his own personal run-ins. Eddie let out a breath and relaxed a bit, but then it hit him. Why was Jim out here so early on a Saturday? Thinking something might be wrong at home, Eddie rushed to the door and unlocked it. "Hey Jim, is everything okay?" "Morning, Eddie. Why are you out here?" "Fine, but your mom sent me to pick you up and bring you home this morning." Jim looked around the cabin. He was in his uniform and Eddie could make out his cruiser a few yards away. Eddie noticed Jim was subconsciously fingering his weapon. "I think you're mistaken, Jim. I'm not supposed to be going home until next weekend, and Mom said that she was going to come out to pick me up." Eddie took a step back and watched Jim's face as he surveyed the tiny cabin. "I know that was the original plan, Eddie, but we all think it's best that you get your things and come with me." Jim stood in the door with the face of a man who was not to be questioned. The hairs on Eddie's arms stood up, and he had no choice but to agree and begin to pack up his belongings. As they packed the car, Eddie could have sworn he was a set of shoe prints that made a trail around his cabin. After driving in silence for a few minutes, Jim casually began asking Eddie what he had been up to last night. "Did you go out at all or just stay by the fire?" Jim asked, his eyes watching Eddie through the rearview mirror. "I was by the fire, but they went inside when it started to rain. That storm was starting, so I didn't want to be caught out in it. It must get a bit creepy out there all alone during a storm," Jim said. That's when Eddie remembered the tapping at the window and the strange rustling sounds. Actually, it's usually fine, but last night I got a bit of a scare. Just as the storm was starting, I thought an animal or something was walking around my site. Probably a coyote or a fox that smelled my supper. Eddie's eyes locked with Jim's. "Did you see anything?" Jim asked. "No." At first, I thought it was some of the local kids that I had kicked out of the lake a couple of weeks ago. Thought maybe they were playing a bit of a prank on me in return, but the rain was starting to pick up, so I decided to stay in the cabin and pretend I didn't notice. Not wanting to sound like a wimp in front of one of his mom's co-workers in the force, Eddie lied about the chills he had experienced. "That's probably for the better," Jim said. "They usually go away if you ignore them." The rest of the ride was silent. Eddie drifted to sleep for a little while, and when he awoke they were pulling into the driveway of his parents' house. His mom was standing on the front steps when they got there. "Eddie," his mom called as he was getting out of the car. "Come inside, I have coffee and breakfast ready." "Thanks, Mom, just let me get my things from the trunk." "Just leave them for now. Jim is going to join us for breakfast. You can get your things after we talk." His mom turned and disappeared into the house. A little confused, but hungry from having missed his morning meal, Eddie shrugged and walked toward the house. Jim locked the car and followed close behind. Eddie sat at the kitchen table and was greeted with a plate of hot pancakes with bacon and a fresh cup of coffee. Eddie began to eat but noticed that Jim and his mom were only drinking coffee. After a couple of minutes of pleasantries, Eddie was starting to get annoyed. "Why did you pick me up early, Mom? And if you're home, why did you send Jim out to get me? Mom, what's going on?" "Eddie," his mother said nice calmly yet firmly in the way only a mother can, as she rested her hand on his arm. He stopped and looked at her. What she said next still gives my husband a pit in his stomach to this day. 3 people were found dead within a mile of that camp early this morning, just as the storm was clearing. The words sounded distant in Eddie's ears. "What do you mean? Like a car accident?" Eddie was confused, but starting to get nervous. A man was found dead at the bottom of a radio tower a half-mile up the road. We don't know how he got in there, but it looks like he tried to climb it and fell off. Eddie's eyes widened. About a half a mile in the other direction, a young man and woman, about your age, Eddie, were found dead. The woman was in the house and the man was found in the backyard. They were both stabbed to death. We found no evidence of a break-in. Jim told this part of the story. He watched Eddie to gauge his reaction. Suddenly, Eddie's pancakes didn't taste too good anymore, and he felt a knot build in his stomach. "So, you came to get me because you were afraid I might be dead too." Eddie said this slowly and looked at both his mother and Officer Jim. "Did you hear or see anything strange last night, Eddie?" His mother tightened the grip on his arm and looked into his eyes. He glanced at Officer Jim, who gave an emotionless stare back. "Yeah. I was telling Jim that I heard what I thought was an animal rummaging around by the fire after I went to bed. It didn't go away, and I thought it might be some of the local kids. I was going to check it out, but the rain was heavy and I thought they would go away if I stayed inside and ignored them. Thank God you did." Eddie's mom hugged him and tried her best to hold back tears. Eddie hugged his mom back. His breath was shallow from the shock. Had he almost been one of the victims of this murder? Had the murderer tried to hide out at the camp after brutally slaying the young couple up the road? If Eddie hadn't gone inside when he did, would he have been murdered while he sat by his fire? Eddie's thoughts were spinning so fast that he didn't even notice Jim get up and leave. It was a half hour later when his mother calmed down enough for Eddie to realize that Jim had driven off with his things. "Mom, you need to call Jim. My things are in his car." "I'll call the station and let them know." Eddie's mom didn't seem surprised that Jim had left without saying goodbye. She just went to the phone and called the station. "Hi Gail, it's Penny." Eddie was wondering when Jim will be back with his bags. At the time, Eddie didn't notice that his mother hadn't had to explain the situation to her co-workers in dispatch. Wouldn't they be wondering why Jim had Eddie's bags in the car? Jim eventually came back on his way home after his shift. He dropped Eddie's stuff off, gave him a squeeze on the shoulder, and said, "Take care of yourself, kid. It was smart of you not to open that door last night." It wasn't until looking back on the incident 5 years later that Eddie realized Jim had come to pick him up for two reasons. Either, after receiving the call about the 3 deaths, they were all afraid that Eddie, out there alone in the food with no way to call for help, made the same fate as the poor souls who lost their lives during that storm, or Eddie himself had been the one who had stabbed a young man and his wife to death in their own home before murdering a third victim near a radio tower in the field adjacent to the camp. Eddie isn't certain, but when he counts the story, he seems to remember when he got his bags back they weren't packed in the same way he had left them. He is convinced that his mother and the officers thought that we had been the perpetrators of the terrible crimes committed that stormy July night in southwestern Ontario. They never did end up finding the killer. Gaia's Decay. Sometimes the greatest horrors start with the smallest complaints. Only one thing was missing from Lonnie's life, and his wife never let him forget it. They had a lovely house, money enough to feel secure and have new things, food to eat, and friends to socialize with. But Sarah and Lonnie did not have a child. After trying for years, even going through rounds of IVF treatments, they still had no child. Had this been a choice they made, perhaps Lonnie and Sarah could have come to terms. But Sarah never made the choice not to have a child. It was all she wanted. And honestly, Lonnie wanted it too. They'd even selected their house on the basis of the lovely positioning of the nursery within. The day that nursery was converted into a home gym caused a huge shift in their life. For a while, Sarah fell into a depression and then she adopted a cat. It was old and had lived a hard life. Sarah seemed to like the idea of caring for it. Lonnie thought that was the end of the baby problem. Then, one day as they sat on their porch staring out at the sunset, Sarah stopped petting the cat in her lap and turned a darkly serious expression toward Lonnie. "I'm going to get pregnant, darling." The odd spark in her eye kept Lonnie awake late that night. He kept picturing her speaking. What new plan had she hatched, and how could he get her to talk to him? Over the next weeks, Sarah began making similar unsettling remarks. "Darling," she would say, her voice tinged with a disturbed tone. "It will be soon. I'm going to be pregnant. You'll see." Lonnie feared that his beloved wife was losing her grip on reality. Still, life went on and he went to work in the mornings and came home in the evening. As a physicist, he didn't make what he considered tons of money, but it was enough to support their little household. And that meant, to him, plenty of time for Sarah to find something that gave her life purpose. He imagined painting or gardening. With so much time spent apart, he could almost convince himself that Sarah was normal when she wasn't making her proclamations. One evening, after a long day at work, Lonnie arrived home to an eerie sight. A cable-like object extended from the ground and snaked its way into the house. He took a closer look and the material appeared to be organic. Though part of him wanted to inspect the place this cable emerged further, the bigger part of Lonnie instantly thought about Sarah inside the house with this thing, and of her odd statements of late. The cable reminded him in a way he didn't like of a giant umbilical cord. Lonnie hurried inside to find the cable snaked through the house toward the back where the stair up to the upstairs bedroom were. He followed it. At the base of the stairs, Lonnie discovered their cat perfectly still, with the cable attached to its belly. Before Lonnie could react and reach out for the creature, the cable twitched and a pulse of energy rolled out into the air. The cat began to shrink. With each pulse of energy, time seemed to roll backward for the feline. First, all the gray left its whiskers. Then, instead of a chubby middle-aged house cat, it instead looked like a lean feral creature, and then it was a kitten, then a smaller kitten, eyes shut as if they'd never opened. Lonnie stared as the last change took place, and he was staring at a fetal feline lying at the foot of the stairs. "Holy," Lonnie said. Then, in a jerky movement, something pulled both the cord and the fetus up the stairs. This was only the beginning. Lonnie's life now had almost nothing he would want. The world had almost nothing he would want, including the awful stench that lay heavy on the air. And as he strapped his diving helmet on, the stench retreated enough for him to think. He reasoned that the complete lack of anything to live for was all the more reason he needed to do something. He'd found the old model diving suit he wore at a local thrift store and left money on the counter for it. Though no one was there to take the payment, Lonnie had a delusion of his own now. This can be undone. Someone can be saved. Sometimes he even managed to believe. Lonnie hopped onto a road bike and made sure his prized possessions were secured, a chainsaw and an underwater scooter. With these things in place, Lonnie took off toward what he considered the center of this new monstrous world. A huge swell rose from the ground just outside town. This thing looked like nothing more than an overgrown pregnant belly, right down the red stretch marks and veins that peered out through its skin. From the apex of this belly grew a towering corpse flower, larger than any naturally grown flower and with a stink grown to match its size. If only this mound had been ornamental and the stench had been the worst crime. But that was not true. The monstrous belly, with a towering corpse flower atop it, claimed all forms of life. In a few short months, it had reduced the world to a barren wasteland devoid of plants, animals, and people. Men, women, children, animals, plants, anything with life had been drawn into this horror. Lonnie was seemingly the only survivor, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was spared because of his connection to Sarah. He blazed on his bike across the landscape and glanced behind him at the back of the bike where the last item of vital value rested, a handheld container marked with the word atonement. It might be too late already to rebuild or repair, but atonement was always possible. Or so, Lonnie hoped as the rotting sweet smell of the corpse flower drew nearer. He could smell it even through the partially sealed suit. He hoped once fully sealed and using canned oxygen, the suit would be able to lock that out. As he rode toward the bloated mass, pregnant with all the life it had been able to steal, he took strength in memory. It was not a pleasant recollection, perhaps even just a creation of his own mind, though Lonnie didn't think so. He recalled a dream. In this dream that had come to him only once, the night before, Sarah appeared before him, her voice echoing through his mind. "The birth of the second desecration is near, darling." This cryptic message left Lonnie both bewildered and filled with dread. Determined to confront the abomination that had consumed the world, he steadied his path along the deserted highway. Not that this had been a deserted highway a year before. He'd driven on it with Sarah plenty of times, usually stuck in traffic jams with only her soft, cool voice keeping him from raging. Now that same voice drove him on in a very different way. Now Sarah was part of the monster. But even if could save nothing else, maybe he could save her. The fact he was alive implied she was still in there and still cared. That had to mean something. Driven by love and a glimmer of hope, Lonnie approached the monstrosity on the horizon. The giant pregnant belly, rooted in the ground, appeared ominous and foreboding. The sickly sweet stench of decay filled his lungs and stung his eyes. As he drew nearer, he could see the giant boulders that had been tossed aside like pebbles as the belly emerged. Now they lay around the base like bubbles in the worst bubble bath ever. Lonnie contemplated his options and the weight of the responsibility he bore. His wife's essence resided within this abomination, and he alone could determine its fate. Summoning his courage, Lonnie hooked up the air to his suit. It cut out the awful scent, at least for a moment. Lonnie almost wished it hadn't, since with that oppressive rot gone from his lungs, he had to face his next task. He had to get inside this monstrosity. He carefully set a hand on the atonement sticker and then pulled his equipment down from the road bike. The chainsaw came first for a moment to the sound of its blade, half expecting the horror in front of him to respond. It did not. The rest of the world was still. No, still was too light a word. The rest of the world was dead. He walked on the bones of a corpse, begging for vengeance. Lonnie swung the chainsaw against the mottled flesh of the belly. It squished and oozed, slicing easily. Red fluid leaked out along with a slimy yellowish substance. Some splashed against Lonnie's helmet, giving the world a blotchy red sheen. He didn't stop. There was no turning back, and nothing to turn back toward. In short order, Lonnie had opened a gap in the monstrous belly using his chainsaw. For a long moment, he stood, chainsaw in hand, and stared into this pathway into the unknown. He had predictions for what lay inside, but this was uncharted territory. To know anything, he'd have to go in. Lonnie turned the chainsaw off and set it on his road bike. He doubted he'd see either tool again, but if he was the last living hand to affect the face of the earth, he'd leave as neat a mark as he could. His hand tightened around the handhold of the atonement container. All his hope was there. Then, hoisting the water scooter, Lonnie took in a deep breath of canned air and ventured inside the demonic swell. Darkness covered him. Encased in this tomb, Lonnie moved slowly at first, with only his headlamp to guide him. As his eyes adjusted to the eerie reddish light that filtered in through the skin and muscles of the belly, he saw more of his new surroundings. The interior revealed a cavernous expanse of flesh arching above and in meaty walls around him. He traveled with an eye to get to the center. He had an idea of what was there. After all, Sarah had promised him a pregnancy, and a pregnancy implied a fetus. Here inside the cloying heat of the belly, Lonnie could not even pretend that anything he did could bring the world back. There was nothing to restore. He'd always known that. For the first time, he truly accepted it. This was all there was, and he was headed toward the center of that evil. Sure enough, he came to a central lake filled with amniotic fluid. It was too dark to see anything within the vast waters, yet small waves lapped out, implying some sort of movement within. Without hesitation, Lonnie plunged into the fluid, utilizing the underwater scooter to navigate swiftly through the watery depths. He kept a firm hold of his atonement. The air inside his helmet tasted stale. Lonnie was sure he had time left before he ran out of air, but not endless time. And he was certain that breathing the air in this place would be death. He couldn't afford fear or indecision. The fluid clung around him, hot and thick. much thicker than water, more like swimming through blood, though it was clear as water. Clear enough to see the bones that floated mixed in the fluid and the vines. At the lake's bottom, he encountered the abomination, the twisted fusion of human, animal, and plant known as the second desecration. Sarah had uttered those words to him. He only believed them. Yet somehow, he expected it to be horrid, a creature from the deep recesses of depravity. Perhaps it was, but in its way, the second desecration was also a baby, though nearly 4 times as large as Lonnie already. Its facial features were almost human, large eyes, a human nose, and a mouth. Extra appendages grew from its back and sides. But its limbs still had the frail look of a fetus. This monstrosity was not yet fit to live outside its womb. Now was the only moment. Drawn closer by a mixture of curiosity, desperation, and love, Lonnie clutched the container tightly. Within it lay something dreadful and oddly wonderful. Something that had only been possible through his work in physics, a devastating mass destruction device, the first antimatter bomb. It was a weapon he had never desired to see made real. Yet now he saw its potential as a means to reshape the impending reality. He'd come to destroy this thing as it had destroyed his world and his life. Amidst the grotesque scene, a thought penetrated Lonnie's mind. If his wife had transformed into the vessel for the second desecration's birth, could this creature, in some unfathomable way, be the son she had always longed for? That Lonnie himself had always wanted. Images of the world as it once was flooded his thoughts, a world already lost irretrievably. Ending the second desecration now would not bring that world back. But to do nothing would have consequences. He imagined the horror that would unfold if he allowed the second desecration to come into existence, a nightmarish realm akin to hell on earth. In the midst of his contemplation, Lonnie understood the precipice before him. The only thing that remained was to decide, should he release the destructive force within the container, returning everything to the void? Or should he permit his son to live, thereby allowing the birth of a distorted and contorted new world? Either act was an end for Lonnie, an end for the world. In the end, Lonnie didn't have anything except a choice. Paranormal, or am I going crazy? I am a 20-year-old male from a small village in the United Kingdom. To put this in perspective, my house used to be haunted. For example, as a young boy, I was asleep and woke up to my wardrobe door opening, and as the door slowly squeaked open, a figure of a dark-haired 7-foot woman climbed out. This was not sleep paralysis, as I was moving around, because I have never moved so quickly in my life to go and tell my mother. But that is only one of the many things that have occurred in my household. So it was a winter's night. Surprisingly, it was a calm night. The moon was shining on my door. In my room, there are 2 doors that lead into my garden, and to open the doors there are 2 separate keys that go into each lock. I was watching YouTube whilst on the phone with my ex-girlfriend, and I heard the decking outside creak. I took my earphone out and went to the door, and I heard someone walking outside. So I moved the curtain across and reluctantly looked outside to see absolutely nothing. I opened my door as quickly as I could and looked down the alley by my house, and nothing was there. I went back inside and everything was perfectly normal up until about an hour later. The keys in my door started shaking aggressively. Now, at this point, I thought someone was in my garden playing mind games with me. I got up and without hesitation, this time opened my curtain, and yet again I saw nothing. I told my ex-girlfriend that I think someone was playing mind games with me, and she said to me, "Your mind is playing tricks on you, you're tired." She had a point. It was about midnight at this point, and I was kind of tired, and as she said that, I heard it. A loud scratch at my door whilst I was standing up, and I opened the curtain again and nothing was there. I said enough was enough and I went upstairs. But before I went to sleep, I had to brush my teeth and use the toilet. As I walked out of my bathroom, I heard someone or something walk across my roof. My roof is a flat roof, so anyone can climb onto it and walk around. I ran upstairs and into my room and go to my window. And as I looked outside, I saw it. The tall 7-foot woman I saw as a young boy. My heart jumped out of my chest. My mind was thinking 1,000 thoughts at once. But something was different this time. It took me 10 seconds to realize what was happening. She was staring at me through the window with her eyes wide open and grinning at me. I jumped into my bed and forced my eyes shut, and it must have worked because I fell asleep. I woke up and told my mom straight away. She told me that before we bought the house, we were told that a family of 3 used to live here a long time ago, and they had a young son who was killed, and the mother went virtually insane and died later on in her life. The boy would sometimes appear in the corner of my mom's eye when she was cleaning the kitchen. She said the boy had blood on a bright yellow shirt and was staring at her with a sinister look. Do you think the mother wanted to hurt me like her son was hurt, or am I simply going crazy? Or did she simply want her home back? The Afterlife Muse. The painting had been put up for auction at a local event raising money for charity. It was an original, according to the auctioneer, by an obscure but talented artist from the early 1900s. It was almost the end of the day and I had yet to see anything that caught my fancy, but the moment the painting was unveiled, I felt something stir in my chest, and I knew I had to have it. Nobody else seemed quite as enthused as me about the portrait, and winning it had been a relatively simple affair. After countering a few other vaguely interested buyers, I managed to secure it for myself. I had it wrapped up in a piece of old, moth-eaten cloth that was found in the auction warehouse, and stowed it in the back of my car, excited to find a place for it in my home. I was a collector of sorts, mostly of antiques and other knickknacks, so it would fit right in with the assortment of old ceramic pots and tarnished clocks and statues that I had sitting in my display cabinet. On the way home from the auction, I started to feel restless. I wasn't sure if it was because the auction had lasted longer than I expected, or because I was tired, or something else, but I struggled to focus on driving and almost pulled out right in front of another car as I turned at the junction leading left towards my house. When I finally pulled into the driveway of my semi-detached, I cut the engine and sat for a moment behind the wheel, taking a couple of deep breaths to clear my mind. When I flicked a glance up towards the rear view, I thought, for just a moment, that I had glimpsed a shadow pressed against the back seat of the car. Between one blink and the next, however, the shadow had disappeared, and I rubbed my eyes, realizing I must have been more tired than I thought. I twisted around to double-check the back seat, just in case, but there really was nothing there. Stepping out of the car, I headed round to the trunk of the car and popped it open. The painting was where I had left it, nestled safely in its bandage of thick yellow cloth. Gripping the edges of the frame, I hoisted it out of the car, careful not to knock the corners against the trunk. Balancing it on one knee, I used my free hand to slam the trunk closed and lock the car behind me, heading up the drive towards the front door. Somewhere behind me, I felt the strange sensation of being watched. Assuming it was one of my neighbors, I turned round to wave, but there was nobody there. The street was empty, deserted. I was the only one out here. Shrugging it off, I headed inside. Laying the covered painting down on the mahogany dining table, I carefully stripped the cloth away to unearth the portrait. It was even more beautiful seeing it up close, instead of across the auction hall. I wasn't a painting connoisseur by any means, but even I could appreciate the balance of colors and the masterful brushstrokes used to create the dichotomy between the subject's face and the backdrop. The signature in the corner, scrawled in black ink, read Thomas Malory. That was the name of the painter. I had never heard of him before the auction, but the painting itself was a masterful piece of portraiture that held up against even more well-known names. I wasn't entirely sure who the depicted subject was, but judging by the brush and palette he was holding, and the easel in front of him, the subject must have been a painter too. Perhaps it was even a self-portrait of Thomas Malory himself. The frame was a deep brass with golden highlights, but there was a faint layer of dust and grime on the edges of the frame, suggesting it had been stored somewhere damp prior to the auction, so I got some low-chemical cleaning supplies and tried my best to clean it up. By the time I was done, the frame was glistening in the swathes of the fading sun pouring in through the window. It wouldn't be long until dusk fell. I must have been sitting here for hours polishing the frame, and my wrist had grown sore. Satisfied with my work, I took the painting over to the display cabinet in my sitting room. Despite the wide array of antiques, I did dust regularly, and the air was tinged with the scent of lemon and rose disinfectant. I hadn't quite decided where I would hang the painting yet, so instead I propped it up on the mantelpiece beside the cabinet, above the bricked-up fire that hadn't been used in years. Sometimes, when I hadn't dusted in a while, I could still smell the tinge of ash and smoke embedded within the bricks. Making sure the painting was secured between the wall and the mantel shelf, I stepped back and admired the portrait in the light of the fading sun. There was something almost melancholy about the painter's face. Those eyes, that sparkled with an unusual, almost corporeal luster, seemed to be filled with a longing of sorts. A yearning for something that was just out of reach. But maybe I was just seeing things that weren't really there. Like the shadow in the car. The light outside was fading rapidly, but part of me couldn't draw my eyes away from the painting, or the man's woeful expression. Why had the painter portrayed him this way? What was the story behind each stroke of the brush? I don't think I, or anyone, would ever truly understand what was going through the painter's mind as he created this piece of art. That, after all, was the beauty and pain of subjectivity, of art, of interpretation. Nobody shared the same idea of inference and understanding, especially when it came to something like this. But perhaps I was overthinking it. I shook myself out of my daze, realizing that the sun had already set, dust painting the edges of the sky in shades of dark purple. I should get something to eat before I go to bed, I thought vaguely as I left the room, closing the door behind me. That night, I awoke to darkness and the feeling that I wasn't alone. I lived on my own, as I had done since separating from my partner a few years ago, and didn't have any pets. There was no probable reason why I would feel like there was someone else here with me, but it was something I felt with a strange sort of certainty, that there was someone here in the dark, lurking just out of sight. My heart began to flutter in my chest, panic rising up through my stomach, but I swallowed it down. Of course, I was being nobody else here. I had locked all the doors and windows before I went to bed, I was sure of it. But I still couldn't quite shake that feeling of unease that tiptoed along the back of my neck, making sweat bead along my skin. Breathing softly through my nose, I fumbled through the dark until my fingers closed around the light switch, clicking it on. Bright yellow light flooded the room, and I threw up a hand to shield my eyes from the glare. Squinting between my fingers, I looked around the room. Empty, as I expected. There really was nobody here. But then I noticed something that made my throat clench up once more. The bedroom door was open. I always slept with it closed, the way I had done since I was a child. I very rarely went to bed with it open, even by accident. Had someone really been in my room? Or was this one of those very rare occurrences where I had forgotten to close it? No, I was certain I had shut it. I remembered the creak and the click of the old door against the frame. It had become an almost bedtime ritual, and I would have felt something was off earlier in the night if I had left it open. I gazed at the crack in the doorframe, shadows pooling around the edges, fear tightening my chest. Was there someone in the house? Should I call the police? No, not without investigating first. I didn't want to waste their time if it really was just my imagination, conjuring threats from nothing. Slipping out of bed, I tiptoed over to the open door, my fingers trembling as they gripped the handle, pulling it open wider. Light from the bedroom spilled out onto the landing, illuminating the rest of the corridor. I couldn't see anything immediately out of place. I held my breath for a few seconds and listened. Above the pounding of my own heart, I could hear nothing. Just the faint moan of the wind and the rustle of the leaves. The house was deathly silent. Swallowing back the lump in my throat, I stepped out of my room and tiptoed down the stairs. I wanted to make sure there really was nobody else in the house before I went back to bed. Downstairs was silent too, except for the faint, intermittent drip of the kitchen tap. I had gotten a glass of water before bed, so perhaps I hadn't twisted the faucet all the way. I padded into the kitchen, switching on the lights as I went, and tightened the leaky tap until it stopped dripping. Feeling somewhat less terrified, I went through each room, checking behind doorways and in closets to make sure nobody was hiding. Every room proved empty. The last place to check was the living room, where the painting was. In a brief lapse of judgment, I considered the possibility that a thief had broken into the house to steal the painting. But who would steal a painting by a less-known artist after I'd only owned it for a day? Shaking away the thought, I approached the living room door and froze. It was one of those old-fashioned doors with a frosted glass window. On the other side of the window stood a shadow. A shadow that wasn't supposed to be there. Fear stabbed my chest, my heart racing. Was there someone on the other side? The shadow wasn't moving. Maybe it was nothing after all. But I had never noticed it before, and I was sure there was nothing on the other side of the door that could be casting it. Heart thundering in my chest, I went back to the kitchen to grab a knife from the drawer and hurried back. The shadow was still there. With a short, sharp breath, I shoved the door open and swung the knife around the edge of the door. Nothing. There was nothing there. A bead of sweat cooled on my brow. All that panic for nothing. Maybe I really was just overthinking it all. I checked the painting just to be sure, but it hadn't moved an inch. In the dark, the eyes seemed to glisten like obsidian. Eerily realistic. I took a moment to calm my racing heart and rationalize the situation, then left the room, closing the door behind me. This time, when I glanced back, the shadow was gone. The next morning, I decided to do some research and see what I could dig up about Thomas Malory and his work. I thought it odd that last night's experience had come right after bringing the painting into my home. Perhaps I was being paranoid and making connections where there weren't any, but I was still curious to see what I could find out. Surely someone, somewhere, must know something about him, even if he was a more obscure name in the art world. I searched for the name on the internet, but all I could immediately find were articles about Thomas Malory, the writer. Not the painter of the portrait sitting in my living room. After scrolling through countless websites and forums, I finally managed to find a page dedicated to the Wright Mallory. There was an old black and white depiction of him, and I recognized him immediately as the same figure in the painting. It was a self-portrait after all. I was sitting with my laptop on the couch in the living room, and my gaze lifted to the painting. Mallory gazed somberly down at me, making my chest pinch. Returning my attention to the webpage, I read through a brief history of his life. According to the text, Thomas Mallory had never managed to succeed as a painter in life and had died in poverty, without selling more than one or two of his works. Towards the end of his life, Mallory had begun to rant about how he had been unable to find his muse, and that he would keep searching for her, even after death. He blamed the muses forsaking him as the reason he had been so unsuccessful and had apparently passed away in a state of bitter despair. When I scrolled down to the bottom, a soft gasp parted my lips. There was a section titled Mallory's Last Work, and the picture attached was the very same one that now sat on my mantle. Mallory's self-portrait before his death. Was that the reason for his despondent look? Had he been unhappy with his career, at a loss, abandoned by the muses? Was that the message the portrait portrayed? I studied it from across the room, raking my eyes over the paintbrush poised against the painted canvas, the palette of muted colors almost drooping in his hand. Was this when he was on the verge of abandoning his passion altogether? Or was that searching, longing look in his eye the plea to the muses, to hear his desperate call? I shook my head, closing my laptop with a sigh. Thomas Mallory, despite being a wonderful artist, had suffered the same fate as so many artists had. Unappreciated, unrewarded, dying nameless, and poor. It was only after death that they truly found fame. The following night, I woke up once more to the feeling that I was being watched from the dark. The room was pitch dark. Through the knitted curtains, there was not even a glimpse of the moon. Only the dark, starless sky, like the open maw of a beast. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. It was just after 3 o'clock in the morning, according to my watch. Using one hand to switch on the lamp, I squeezed my eyes closed against the light, waiting a few seconds for my eyes to stop watering and finally adjust. The air in the room was still, undisturbed. The door was closed. Nothing felt out of place, except for the strange prickle of unease tiptoeing down my spine. I gazed around the room for a few minutes, waiting in silence for something to happen, but nothing did. Once again, it was all in my head. I reached for the lamp again, my fingers brushing the switch. The moment the room plunged into darkness was the moment I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, muted footsteps coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I held my breath, my pulse racing beneath my ribcage. Was I hearing things? There, against the quiet of the night, was the sound of retreating footfalls. Someone was inside the house. This time, there was no mistake. Fighting the rising panic in my chest, I fumbled to switch on the light and slipped out of bed. The air was cold against my legs, and I shivered, tiptoeing towards the door. I wrapped my fingers around the handle and tugged it open, as quietly as I could. I peered out. Nothing. The footsteps grew fainter, moving further away, until eventually I could hear them no more. Had they already left? I didn't want to leave anything to chance. Keeping close to the wall, I padded down the hallway and stood at the foot of the stairs, peering down. I couldn't see anything. Nothing stirred amongst the shadows. Silence pressed against me like something tangible, broken only by my short, panicked pants. Taking the stairs slowly, I reached the bottom and peered around the edge of the banister. My vision swam in the darkness, and I tried to ignore the feeling that there was something crouched in the shadows, waiting to catch me off guard. It's all in your head. This time, I passed by the kitchen and dining room and went straight to the living room. Straight to the painting. The door was open. Inside, the darkness felt thick, suffocating. I reached blindly through the dark until I found the light switch and flipped it on. The room felt warmer than the rest of the house. The air felt disturbed, like someone had been here recently. There was nobody hiding behind the doorway. Nobody crouched behind the sofa. Everything was in its place. Closing the door behind me, I walked up to the painting and gasped. My legs wobbled, feeling like they were about to give way. My head began to spin, not quite willing to believe what I was seeing. The painting had changed. The painter, Thomas Malory, had disappeared, leaving an empty space, a dark, mottled void where he once stood. The paintbrush and palette had been discarded, and the canvas, that had before been turned the other way, was now facing me, containing a new painting. A new portrait. A portrait that looked exactly like me.